everybody to our fourth installment in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'll just do a quick recap of where we're at before we move into tonight's materials. The general theme for tonight's materials is just understanding the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their writings in the broader context of Second Temple Judaism and the concerns that Judaism has in this time period, theological concerns, concerns about the law, concerns about the cosmology of the world, concerns about the relationship between God and human beings. And so I'll dive into quite a bit of that, looking at a lot of texts tonight. So with limited examples, which I'll point out, pretty much everything that we'll be talking about tonight will be like actual material from the scrolls. So just to remind us of where we've been, the first session was, of course, about the discovery of the scrolls, how they were lost and how they were found. In our second session, right before Thanksgiving, we looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Bible, how the Bible is used in the scrolls, the Bible as a subject matter of the scrolls, and then what we learn about the Bible from the scrolls. And then last week, our session dealt with issues around the community of the scrolls. And we hypothesized that the Essene community, religious community known from historians of antiquity, was the author of the scrolls for the most part. We talked about other theories as well, but we kind of centered around that strong hypothesis of the Essene community and the data within the scrolls that could give us some information about that community. And today we're moving on to the theology of the ideology and the spiritual concerns of Second Temple Judaism as reflected in the scrolls. And then just as a reminder for our last session will be next week. That session will deal with the scrolls and the subject of modern controversies, as well as some odds and ends, things that just don't really fit with the other broader information, treasure maps and fakes and forgeries and controversies around those sorts of things. So without any further introduction, I'd like to just get started on today's session. We'll be kind of divided up into three parts. The first part will be kind of an extended look at Judaism in the Second Temple period, not with kind of the longue durée subjects of Judaism, like the temple or the land, but some focusing a little bit more on the things that are distinctive in the period of the Second Temple, and the distinctions between Jewish groups in the Second Temple period. What controversies are important to them and where they come from. I'll digress from our primary topic of angels and demons to talk a little bit about Torah at Qumran as well, and what the Torah at Qumran can tell us about the development of Jewish law in the Second Temple period. Again, within kind of the broader schema of sectarian controversy within Judaism. And then finally, we'll look at our subjects of angels and demons themselves in quite a bit of detail in a variety of texts, everything from legal texts to apocalyptic texts to exorcism texts. All of these things are found all jumbled up together in the Qumran materials. And the overall portrait is one of a community that is very concerned with the idea of spiritual powers in the world and their relationship with spiritual powers. They imagine themselves to be closely linked with the angels, and their enemies to be closely linked with the demons or the devils. And we'll explore that, like I said, in quite a bit of detail. But in order to get there, I just want to say a little bit about how ideas change in Judaism in the Second Temple period at a superficial level, but just enough so that we understand when we talk about why fate and free will are important to them, or why determinism is important to them, why life after death is important to them. These are ideas that are coming into the practice of Judaism, both in the land and in the diaspora, by virtue of the Hellenistic world that they are part of. By the time the scrolls are put together in their current form, the world has been Greek for hundreds of years. And so we see in the Judaism of this period a very strong influence of both the Persian and Egyptian wisdom traditions and Greek philosophy, which is itself an heir to those traditions. And so a lot of the questions that all Jewish groups are dealing with will be questions that are put upon them and all other religions of the age by Greek philosophy, by philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. And the shortcomings in earlier religious traditions that don't address things in kind of the Greek philosophical way, that will lead to controversy. And then what scholars have, it's fitting that we're, entering the season of Hanukkah right now, in terms of talking about the challenge of Hellenism. So when the world becomes Greek, it raises questions about how the law should be kept. Should it be kept at all? Should the practices described in the Torah of Moses continue to be adhered to? Or should people follow a more cosmopolitan way of life? People are concerned about how God determines human affairs. They are thinking of the Israelite God as a Platonic God, as a God that is a God of philosophy in this time period, as much as it is a historical God and a God of a relationship with a particular people. And everybody is also wondering what happens when we die, and what happens at the death of the world. These are questions that everybody is very engaged in the Second Temple period, not just Jews of different sectarian movements, but Greek philosophers, Roman philosophers, Zoroastrians, early Christians. All communities are really religious communities are interested. Mystery cults, they're all interested in this question of what happens to us, what happens to the world. It's the stamp that Plato and Aristotle have left on the thinking of pretty much everyone in the Western world in this time. That being said, it is important to remember that temple worship and animal sacrifice and the animal sacrifice system continue to survive at a national level and at a personal level in this time period. So the temple complex is dramatically expanded and turned into a major tourist destination for the eastern part of the Roman Empire by Herod in the same period as the scrolls. At the same time, the practice of pilgrimage festivals is starting to really solidify. The festivals themselves have been around from before the time of the Second Temple or the late Second Temple period, but because Jews are spread through a large diaspora that goes all the way from India to Spain, the relationships between these communities, the financial relationships and the pilgrimage relationships with the Jerusalem temple become extremely important in the Second Temple period. And there's also a temple tax, and that money makes the temple system, the priests, the city of Jerusalem, and the government in Jerusalem, first the Herodian government and then the Roman government, quite wealthy. Jerusalem becomes maybe the fourth or fifth largest city in the world in the first century of the Common Era. And right away, I see a hand from Aaron.
Yeah, so I'm assuming this is all with the support of the Roman government?
Absolutely, yes.
Why?
So the Roman government, because the Roman government, believe it or not, this is what most people think, the Roman government has respect for religions of great antiquity, and they have less respect for religions that are kind of new on the scene. And so they are broadly supportive of the religious systems in Egypt, in Israel, and in the Zoroastrian, the Persian world, because they view them to be religions of great antiquity. And I don't know if they're superstitious. They're not so superstitious that they won't violate the temple by just kind of breaking into it. They do that multiple times. But they do kind of respect the antiquity of the temple system. That's something that you'll see in quite a few Roman writers, that the Israelite, the Jerusalem temple system is recognized as one of the kind of the major world religions that they don't mess with. Until they do, until there's a violent revolution in the 60s of the Common Era, and then they destroy it, obviously. But until that time, they viewed it as a system that they respected. So just kind of moving into from the temple system into philosophy for a second. So Jewish groups differ as to how they're all dealing with the questions raised by Platonic philosophy, but they approach them in different ways. The Pharisees, and people will almost never say this about the Pharisees are like real Platonists. They believe in fate. They believe in acting virtuously. They believe that souls are immortal, and that they believe there's a system of rewards and punishments after death for people who live virtuously, who were evil, and they believe in what is often termed within the Christian theological tradition as a general resurrection on the last day. So that entails two things. One is a last day. They believe in that the time will stop at some point, and that on that day when time stops, there'll be a resurrection of the righteous to some kind of reward, and the wicked to some kind of punishment. And God is the judge in that system. The God of Israel is the judge of the whole world. In the Pharisees' view of things, and the Pharisees are, of course, the tradition that survives within Judaism in a much larger way than the other traditions, and so those ideas get carried forward into later time periods. The medieval scholars will adapt their thinking, but this is kind of the system that the Pharisees are holding to. The Sadducees, on the other hand, hold almost the exact opposite point of view on some of these things. They believe that at least as Josephus tells us, that the soul dies with the body. And that they don't think that there's any kind of life after death. They don't believe in fate. They believe in free will. So they are not determinists. And they also don't adhere to, at least in the words of Josephus, a more elaborate system of keeping the law beyond the way that they read the law of Moses in the Torah. As we'll discuss a little bit more when we get to the legal section, the Pharisees have a different view, and the Qumran community has a different view as well, from this kind of basic keeping of the law approach to things. This is what Josephus tells us about the Essenes. Their view is a mix or a cross between the views of the Pharisees, or at least they share elements of both. They, like the Pharisees, also believe souls are immortal. They again have sort of a Platonist or mystical kind of way of understanding this. The soul kind of unites with the body, but the flesh is really corrupt in the minds of the Essenes. And this is definitely something that we see in the scrolls reflected fairly well. They are very focused on cultivating a purity of the body through everything from refraining from impure foods to frequently making frequent use of the mikvah, refraining from relationships with people who might be in excess contact with non-Jews, and so might transmit, the contamination of corpse impurity or impurity associated with unclean meats and that sort of thing. So they're very, very, very focused on this kind of bodily purity. And then they don't necessarily. It's not a heaven and hell in the sense that it would develop in Christianity, but also kind of an eternal realm of rewards and punishments that's sort of for the soul, not for the body. And then they are also definitely believers in the last days, as we will get to in just a moment. They believe more so than the Pharisees or even the early Christians that the last days are upon them in a particular kind of way. Another thing that people are really concerned about in this time period, and it's something that you see throughout the world, but it's definitely the case in Judaism, is an interest in what I would term spiritual powers. There's maybe a decline of some sorts in the idea of like lots of gods, multiple gods. That system of multiple gods, gods that have their domain of love or war or that sort of thing, has fallen out of favor throughout the world. It's still there to some extent, but it's falling out of favor in kind of the philosophical circles anyway. But it's matched by this kind of corresponding rise in a belief in evil spirits and in good spirits as well. And we find that Judaism of the early Second Temple period, like the Persian period, doesn't really have this idea of they have angels from the Bible. There's angels, that talk to Jacob, or angels that visit Abraham and Lot, and these sorts of things. But they don't have like this system of good spirits and evil spirits in the way that it will come to be developed in the Second Temple period. But some literature of the Second Temple period gives us a borrowing from kind of Greek and Mesopotamian religion. And the system comes to be that there are good and evil angels, or higher powers in heaven, that we, frequently Malachim for angels, and Nephilim, creatures that are from an obscure passage in the Noah's Ark story, are kind of the good and evil angels. And then demons. The word demon itself comes from the Greek word daimon, which means a kind of a spiritual power, a lower spiritual power in the philosophy of classical and Hellenistic religion of Greece. And that it's so much an idea, that a new idea on the scene, that even though Jews have words for these kinds of spirits, they just use the Greek word daimon or daimonia to be their evil spirits in the religious system of the Second Temple. And the last thing that I will say is, anytime you're dealing with angels and demons, the other thing that kind of enters folk religion is charms and exorcism. So this is the phenomena. If you have demons, then you have to get rid of demons. And there are different ways of doing that. And so we see a huge explosion in the use of magical charms, amulets, the use of the Torah as a charm. These are all things that emerge in the Second Temple period as part of the kind of popular religion of the land of Israel in this time. Another phenomenon that is becomes more popular as time progresses is what we call apocalypticism and eschatology. These are technically slightly different but overlapping ideas. Apocalypticism is really about revelation. It's about angels or other kind of spiritual figures like an Elijah or an Enoch, giving a revelation to human beings. And so it could be a revelation of heaven. It could be a revelation of things that are to come. It could be a revelation of the history of time. We see all of these things in the genre of apocalypse. But then often what we see in apocalypse is an immediate concern with the end of days or the end of things. And there are a couple of things that scholars of religion in this period think might be behind this phenomenon of apocalypticism and eschatology. One is what we term the end of prophecy. And so as the canon of the Bible begins to close, the Torah's canon is already closed, but the prophetic tradition's canon is also starting to close. The books that we know as the major and minor prophets, the Scroll of the 12 and Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah and those sorts of things, those are kind of become fixed texts. And that kind of prophecy is not recognized anymore as a valid kind of way of thinking about religion in the Second Temple period. And so what takes the place of that is these visions and revelations by angels to specific human beings. The other thing that is really fascinating, we see across a wide variety of religions in the Roman world, is this phenomenon of the end of days. And there are two kind of theories as to how it might come about. One is through increases in the knowledge of astronomy and astrology. People may be, there's like significant advances in the early Hellenistic period in the development of astronomy. And so people may feel like they're better able to predict the course of human events with astrology than they were before. But also we have a completely different system of time. Is like people are thinking very differently about time in this period. Paul Kosman from Harvard has an outstanding book called Time and Its Enemies in the Seleucid Empire that talks about this. It's really the first time that people are keeping track of time with a beginning, and then a beginning means an end. Before, people were like, the year is the year 15 of Xerxes or whatever. The Romans, the Greeks and the Romans come on the scene, and they impose a new order of time that has a beginning date, and a beginning date, that's when people start to become concerned for the first time with how old is the earth and that sort of thing. And so this also, a beginning implies an end, and that's kind of the best theory we have as to why suddenly people are very, very, very focused on this phenomenon of apocalypticism. They become focused on it first, and then things start to happen in the world, like the destruction of the temple and the war that ensues. They begin to interpret the events, the signs of the times, through the lens of this revelation and eschatology as well. Additionally, there are developing in this time period different ideas about how to live the Jewish law, both as a community and individually. And a couple of different possibilities emerge, and these will come to be the possibilities over long periods of time as well. But really, from the Second Temple period onward, we see a variety of different approaches to Torah. One is to just try to observe the commandments as literally as possible, and just keeping the law of Moses, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, and the other legal passages in Exodus and that sort of thing, as a law that gives basic commandments that should be followed as they're written. Another approach, which we'll see in the development of the thinking of the Pharisees, is what we call a fence around the Torah, and that is a second legal system. This is kind of me as an outsider describing this phenomenon, but a second legal system that's meant to protect the laws of the Torah. So so that you don't come close to infringing on a commandment, you kind of keep a stricter version of the Sabbath, or you keep a stricter version of the dietary laws. So that will become a part of the system as well. And then alongside of that is the development of an idea that those second set of ideas, or the more restrictive set of ideas, or at least the interpretation of those ideas, has its own history of revelation as well. That's an interestingly different development in the Pharisaic tradition and in the tradition that we see at Qumran. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Other possibilities are obviously to de-emphasize the law in a variety of ways, maybe just by treating it as a philosophical system, an ethical system, or treating it as a symbolic system where the Torah is an allegory for some Platonic philosophy, or some Aristotelian philosophy, or maybe a mystery religion, even as we see in some cases. And that's a common phenomenon in different diaspora communities in particular, and will evolve into Gnosticism. And then finally, some Jewish communities reject all or part of the law. We call that antinomianism. The early Christian community will come to become a semi-antinomian community that rejects the practice of Jewish law in various instances. So just to kind of remind us real quick of the different groups in this time period, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots, the Essenes, and the Jesus movement are kind of the historical groups that we know about from this time period, and they give us, they're all slightly different on their approaches to these different ideas. The Sadducees, as I kind of already mentioned, their attitude towards the temple is that they control the temple, so they are invested in the animal sacrificial system that continues to exist in the Herodian temple. They are proponents of free will. That is to say, they don't believe in the fates, like the three fates of the Greeks. They don't believe in a resurrection or an immortal soul, and they don't have an oral Torah. They kind of try to keep to the Torah of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Pharisees, on the other hand, they continue to support the temple, and they're always participants in the temple system, but they have a different theology. So they believe in fate, they believe in a resurrection, and they believe in this increased categories of observance of the law around a secondary sort of set of revelations. The Jesus movement seems like some people would go so far as to say the Jesus movement begins as a Pharisaic movement, and that the Essenes begin as a Sadducean movement. I'm not willing to go there, but that's something that you might hear from someone else. The Jesus movement will initially support the temple until it doesn't. And Jesus kind of condemns the temple at the end of his life, and then it moves away from the temple as a system. But before that, it's supportive of the temple. They also believe in fate. They also believe in the general resurrection, but they are what we call antinomian. They take kind of a negative view of the law. And we see in the preaching of Jesus that you find in the Gospels, he has kind of a negative view of the law, or at least of the basic practice of the law as we think of it. The Zealots we don't really know a lot about, and so I'm going to kind of leave them out of the story tonight. But the remainder of the story will be to kind of explore where the Essenes are in each of these things, and then it turns out we learn a lot from the scrolls about how they are interacting with these ideas and with other communities that are sharing these ideas with them. With that introduction, I want to look at the law for a couple of minutes. I don't have necessarily some of the most interesting examples from the law, but they are interesting in terms of like some of the things that we learn about Torah in this time period from the materials that we have. We have to work with what they give us, and so people do spend a lot of time looking at, in very, very fine detail, their approach to the Torah and their approach to living the daily and the community laws of the Torah. So just a quick summary of the legal material and the questions that it raises. There's not a lot of legal material at Qumran, but there's enough to answer some key questions. And the key question, some of these key questions are: where did the Essenes, or at least the community of the scrolls, stand in relative position to the traditions that are kind of described by the other groups? But more interesting than that, at least to those of us who study this time period, is it tells us a lot, just from the little details that we have, about how Jewish law was approached before the Mishnah. Before we had the scrolls, we had the Torah, and then we had the Mishnah in around 200 of the Common Era, and we had a big gap where we didn't really know a whole lot about what people were doing. We relied on the New Testament and other sources that are not they're not complete, and they're not insider sources. So it's actually the little bit of details that we have tell us a great deal about the way that all Jewish communities might have interacted with the Torahs. Some just kind of key information up front. it seems like on a lot of legal disputes, the scrolls agree with the Sadducees and they disagree with the Pharisees. And there's one text that I'm going to look at some examples from this 4Q MMT that may even be a lost work that is briefly mentioned in the Mishnah. And so we may have discovered a new source of or a source in the development of Jewish law at Qumran in this phenomenon of this text called 4Q MMT, which I'll talk about in a second. But the second kind of detail that they tend to agree with the Sadducees, but they also, their approach to the law is basically what I would call an authoritative interpretation of the Torah approach. So it's not an oral Torah approach. It's not a rabbinic approach where people dispute and then arise at some kind of consensus with a court of law or a court of sages or anything like that. They have like a top-down system in which the leader, the teacher of righteousness, has taught the correct interpretation of the Torah and in the context of Qumran. So we do have this fascinating document from Qumran. It's actually one of the original and best preserved documents that is called the Temple Scroll. And the Temple Scroll is it's like a sort of like a body of Jewish laws. And it's broken down into like 15 different components. And it presents this legal system of authoritative Torah as the community interprets it, laid out around different categories of information. So we have the example of the practice, the building of the sanctuary, and the practice of the daily sacrifices in the sanctuary. We have purity regulations concerning entering the temple. We have purity regulations concerning the cities of Israel, Jerusalem, and other cities. And then we have some issues that deal with legal matters, more like judicial matters. So the appointments of judges and officers, for example, is a subject of this particular scroll as well. We have also issues related to vows and oaths, issues related to the service of priests. And I'm sorry, I'm seeing two hands, but I'm not sure who the hands are. I think Aaron's one of them. Yes,
just quickly. And do they think this Temple Scroll has one author, or is it multiple authors?
That's a great question. I don't think that we know the answer to that. And so remember when we were kind of exploring the idea of the relationship between the scrolls and the community. One of the things that's not totally clear is whether this is the community's scroll or if it's something that they inherit from a larger religious tradition, either a larger Essene religious tradition or even a Sadducee tradition or some form of Sadducee tradition. And the reason why I say that is if you look at it, if you look at these are the kind of the headings here, there are some apocalyptic pieces in it and that sort of thing, but it's not concerned with kind of the core sectarian questions of Qumran, like sons of light and darkness and the last days and the wicked priest and the teacher of righteousness and the apostasy and the temple and the calendar, and these are all, I'm just sort of rambling here, all the things that seem to be like religious concerns of the people who are worshiping daily at Qumran aren't really the organization of material that we see here in the Temple Scroll. In fact, what we have looks more like the organization of materials in the Mishnah. So that the orders of the Mishnah are a little bit different from this. But it's another thing like the Mishnah. Before the Mishnah, before the discovery of the Temple Scroll, the Mishnah was kind of sui generis. We had nothing older than it that looked like a body of legal material where people organized it and tried to answer questions about how should judges be elected, or who should be put to death for worshiping idols, or so, what causes you to be guilty of that kind of very serious crimes and that sort of thing. We never really had a piece of literature before the Temple Scroll that looked like a Mishnah, and so that's really, really cool for understanding the development of Judaism, because now what we know is that there are competing Mishnahs out there, like in this time period. So there's maybe every group had a Mishnah, or every group had a text that they used that wasn't just reading Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy to get the information that they wanted to get. And so that's really cool that it sets the development of Jewish law as a system back a little bit in time from the post Second Temple period into the Second Temple period in some respects. And it also, for people who are concerned about the historicity of the Mishnah and whether the Mishnah might authentically go back to the time period it describes, this is adding a little bit of evidence to that. It says that some of the disputes that the Mishnah remembers as being like disputes between the Sadducees and Pharisees, or the disputes between Hillel and Shammai, some of those things may actually be remembered in other documents. And so that's, I think, one of the really cool things about the Temple Scroll. But it's also a little bit different from the Mishnah. And so I'll show just one little illustration here of the difference. So on the left-hand side here is the Temple Scroll, and the portion of the Temple Scroll that deals with the sacrifice of the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement. And then on the right side, I have the text from Mishnah Yoma 6, that I've Mishnah Yoma 6 is quite long, and so I've cut snippets of it out that I think illustrate some of the differences between the way that the scrolls approach law and the way that the Mishnah, the rabbis, will come to approach law. One is that the law of the Temple Scroll is still somewhat what we would call apodictic. It's like dictated. It's like it says how it should be. And I actually underlined in the left-hand side all of the shalls in this piece of the Temple Scroll to just give you a sense of, actually, I even missed some of the shalls, it looks like, but just how, there's another shall that I missed, how prescriptive it is. And it says, basically, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest shall cast lots on the two goats, and then he shall bring the bull, and then he shall wash his hands and feet in a certain way, and he shall make the confession over the head of the animal, and he shall lead the animal out to the desert, and by the hand of the man who is waiting ready, and then the goat, even the goat has a shall here, the goat shall bear responsibility for the iniquities or the sins of all the people of Israel. So kind of not only a kind of close correspondence with the Torah of Moses, but very, very, very prescriptive. And so that's a kind of an authoritative approach to the Torah here. And so on the right-hand side, when we look at the Mishnah, we see the Mishnah can be quite authoritative too, but it also has some other features that are really kind of pretty cool, significant developments in the tradition of Jewish law. One is that it's narrative. So instead of just saying the high priest shall do this and the goat shall do that, it tells a story of, it's almost in a almost midrashic way. Tells a story of what should happen. So the high priest comes over and he says this, and then the people respond in a certain way, and it's almost like it's narrating a historical event. But it's also questions, details that aren't in the Leviticus and Deuteronomy versions of these stories. So, the rabbis want to know, or the readers of the rabbis' literature want to know, well, who is eligible to lead this scapegoat? And so they will go into a discursus, into an aside on who's eligible to lead the goat. Then they'll say, the Mishnah also has this phenomenon of disputive discourse. So, Rabbi Yossi disagrees with kind of the sages of the Mishnah who are unnamed. Yep, Beth.
Yeah, so I have a question about that, because the temple scroll is prescriptive, as in, like, they're trying to capture exactly what you're supposed to do with the ritual,
Yeah.
while the Mishnah seems to be saying, well, this is what they did do. Because my understanding is the Mishnah, at least most of it, came after the temple was destroyed.
Yeah, so the Mishnah was as it emerges as a written text in between 200 and 225 of the Common Era, but it definitely seems like it preserves material that is older than that. It doesn't seem invented. Some of it sometimes seems invented, but for the most part, it does seem to remember Second Temple practices.
No, but what I'm saying is that it's written like, oh, we're capturing this to remember it, not to do it.
Well, in the case of this, yes, that's definitely true. But this phenomenon of disputation that's in the Mishnah all over the place, almost in every chapter, where it may be that it preserves the memory, but then it also says maybe Rabbi Yossi or Rabbi Ishmael, and he tells a different story. That also is not present in the temple scroll, and it's interesting in terms of a history of religion, I think, because it seems to be relating a very different idea of authority between the two different communities. So the community of the scrolls seems to be, there's a decider, so to speak, that is just kind of prescribing the authoritative version of the Torah. But in the Mishnaic world, rabbis disagree, and then they come to a consensus. And so it's almost like more of a democratic system, or at least a system with competing parties. So that's how far back, like we don't unfortunately, other than the memories of disputes between Hillel and Shammai, we don't really have a lot to know how far back this goes with the rabbis. But it's definitely a big difference between the communities that might be explained by the way the communities themselves live as well, if that makes sense. So I want to talk about another text for a second, which is this text called 4Q MMT, the Miksat Ma'aseh HaTorah, sometimes called in English the Halachic letter. And this is a letter that is preserved in very fragmentary form, but it still has a very, very fascinating letter that is found in the materials at Qumran. And it seems to be something that is written from one kind of legal authority or one community leader to another. And different theories have been put forward for this. One is that, I guess the traditional Dead Sea Scrolls kind of idea is that it's a letter from the teacher of righteousness to the wicked priest. It might be a letter by the Essenes to the Sadducees, or as Larry Schiffman at NYU has suggested, it may even be a letter from the Sadducees to the Pharisees. And it describes kind of two legal issues over which the senders, the authors of the letter, disagree with the recipients. And they concern the calendar, they concern animal sacrifice, they concern who may enter the sanctuary, different kinds of prohibited marriages between classes of marriage that we wouldn't be necessarily totally focused on, like second cousins and that sort of thing, or sons of sisters. And I don't remember exactly what the dispute is, but what's really interesting about this is the kind of the way it ends, and it ends with kind of a consolation about how disappointing it is that they're separated from one another, as well as like a plea for a reconciliation between the two groups. And so it can be taken in a couple of different ways. One is to suggest that the Qumran community, this may be their letter in an attempt to try to explain why they won't participate in the temple community and pay the temple tax and make the animal sacrifices like everyone else. And it's because they consider these theological disputes to be unresolved. Or it might also be something bigger than that. It might be something that is not about Qumran at all, but about a bigger dispute within the Jewish world about some of these issues of law. So kind of an arcane piece of legal disputation that is centered in this work concerns the purity of liquids that are poured into a container. So what's significant about this is like the groups don't agree. If you pour liquid from an unclean container into a clean container, does it become contaminated or not? Because does the liquid carry contamination with it? I like to, when I was teaching my students during COVID about this, you may remember we had a controversy about whether drinking fountains, like soda fountains at a fast food restaurant, could transmit COVID or not. And this is an analogous kind of a question, but with ritual impurity in mind, container contaminate another container. And so I have the dispute on the top here as it's described in 4Q-MMT, and the community, whoever it is, whether it's Qumran or the Sadducees or what have you, are saying, they say that pouring does not separate the impure from the pure, and poured liquid and receptacles are the liquid and the receptacle are alike. And what's really, again, kind of cool about this, going back to the Mishnah, is the Mishnah in Mishnah Yadayim 4 remembers that this is a dispute in the Second Temple period between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So some people have gone so far as to say, well, is what we see in the Mishnah, does it even know about this letter? Is this a letter that remembers disputes between the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. There's not, one way or another to know that. But again, in terms of our understanding of the development of Jewish law, a thing that we learned from the Second Temple period is that letters are going back and forth, disputing these things. So it's not just the product of somebody's mind of, I think it could be this, or I think it could be that. This school says this school says that. It's a product of actual discourse that's happening between communities. And we have, at least one example of genuine correspondence between two potential communities over questions of Jewish law. So that I think is another really cool thing that we learn from Qumran. So we'll have to leave law. Aaron, real quick, did you have a question?
This scroll is found at Qumran, right?
Yeah, 4Q-MMT is known only from Qumran. Yes.
So how do we know that it ever got to the Pharisees or wherever they were sending it to?
We actually don't know. It's a good question, and there are people who study the forms and genres of ancient letters, but we don't know if this missive was ever sent. That's a great observation and a great unresolved question. Obviously, it was found at Qumran, so it was not found at its destination. neither was the reply found at Qumran. So it's a great great question. It may even be somebody using the genre of a letter to explain their position about disputes, but it's a great question. Yeah, but it does show that at least this kind of mode of discourse of rabbis or community leaders, if rabbis are not yet the correct term, exchanging disputes of Jewish law between communities and laying them out in the form of a legal syllabus, and not even really making an argument from Leviticus or Exodus or whatever itself. So pretty cool in that respect. But I want to leave the law aside because we've got to talk about angels and demons as well. Angels and demons are super important to the Qumran community, and what I hope to do is just with the remaining 25 minutes or so that we have, lay out just a syllabus of all the different ways that angels and demons factor into the worship, ideological, theological, even ethical life of the community at Qumran. So we find angels in different, I guess I never really give a definition of an angel, but angels are kind of these spiritual powers that have the ability to kind of go between heaven and earth and to intermediate between human beings and the divine. And we find them in the Hebrew Bible, especially in the early, like the Genesis accounts of angels, and in the Jacob story, angels in the Abraham stories, and that sort of thing. And as kind of beings who come from God, that have knowledge that human beings don't have, that can intermediate between humans on God's behalf, can intervene with God on humans' behalf, and can transmit, knowledge and even power. And they may have like power in the physical universe as well. And so angels get developed as a theological category through the Second Temple period. And so we have in the book of Daniel, which is an early Second Temple period book, somewhat limited ideas about angels. Enoch, a non-canonical book that's well known from this time period in Christian Bibles and that sort of thing, has a more advanced ideas. And then later Second Temple writings will have even more. They'll have more ranks of angels, more jobs for angels, and that sort of thing. But I put this quote from a paper from Matt Walsh in here, where he starts by taking the book of Jubilees, and Jubilees is an important book, non-biblical book for the people at Qumran. But the idea that the Qumran community can best be thought of as they think angels are in their presence because they themselves are sons of light, and that because they are sons of light, that sons of darkness, who are wicked angels or even demons, might be working against them to oppose them. And that's an idea that they often, like, they have a felt presence of the angels around them. So it's a little bit different of a sentimentality from the Hebrew Bible itself, where let's say Jacob is running away from his brother, and he's running through the desert, and he just has an encounter with an angel, and the angel gives him a message, or is going to fight him or something like that. It's a very kind of episodic, unpredictable theophany of an angel that you can't summon an angel, you can't and they certainly aren't like present in the room with you at all times. The Qumran community, from some of the things that we have, they seem to believe that the angels are with them, if not all the time, then at least during the Sabbath and during the community meals and that sort of thing. And I'll show some texts in just a second that talk about that. But before I get to kind of the angels and the worship and the community life, I want to talk about some other jobs that angels do. And they're I kind of bin these into a couple different categories as what I call eschatological service, the work that angels do at the end times. And the answer is that they can fight in armies on God's behalf, and that there may be a war coming in heaven between wicked angels and good angels. Angels can also reveal things to people. They can give people visions, and they can tell people what heaven is like. They can tell people the events that are going to come to pass, and that sort of thing. And the Qumran community has its own unique angel revelations that we've never seen anywhere else. So there are texts that are unique to Qumran that deal with that. One of them is this called the New Jerusalem Scroll. That's actually subject of a chapter in my dissertation. So I'm like super interested in that, in this phenomenon of revelation. But Ellis, did you have a question? I saw a hand real quick. Are you on mute?
Yeah, sorry, it took me a while. So did the angels come about, do you think, because there was a general belief in them at that time? It wasn't just an Essene's thing.
No, there definitely is a general belief in them at this time.
And is it because, all right, go ahead. Why do you think they came about?
So the angels themselves are in the Bible. And so it's likely that all of the Jewish communities had some idea about angels. They are part of this, like, I'm trying to find the right language to describe this. It's like they think the world is haunted in a way by these spiritual powers. And we see this in different religious systems of different kinds, even in traditional, like, tribal communities in Africa and Southeast Asia and that sort of thing. There's like, oftentimes communities will develop this idea of like the presence of spirits, and the spirits explain a phenomena or circumstances that aren't otherwise explainable to people. It may be an outgrowth of this, like, Greek free fate and free will, or Greek ideas of the daimonia. We don't know, but we do know that they're like totally obsessed with them. So I wish I could give you a better answer. I asked somebody that is more of an expert on this, so that I see if I can get you an answer for next time. But they definitely just, like, they emerge on the scene. But at least the New Testament community, the Christian community contemporaneous with Qumran, believes in angels too. And they think that the angel Gabriel appears to the Virgin Mary at the conception of Jesus. They think that angels will be around at the Last Judgment. So they also have this idea of angels having a role as well. The last thing that angels do, and I do have an example of each of these to look at, is the angels can send the demons away. They can send the bad forces away. You can call upon an angel to protect you. We call that apotropaic, kind of use of angels as well. And so we see just a little bit of evidence, I think more than other people are recognizing, maybe a little bit of evidence from that at Qumran, that we have this apotropaic idea of angels. So one kind of very apocalyptic eschatological text that we have from Qumran is called the War Scroll. The War Scroll is it's technically a legal text. It describes the way that communities should be organized and govern themselves from a military point of view, from a purity point of view, etc., in the war of the last days, which will be a war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And the way the war develops in the narrative is that it starts as a conflict between Israel and its ancient enemy neighbors, Edom and Moab, but then it spreads to the whole earth. And by the time you're engrossed in the story of the War Scroll, it becomes clear that it's a war between Israel and the Romans. But then it pivots again to as the war between the Israel and the Romans is happening, there's a war in heaven between the forces of Belial, or Satan, and the angels of God who side with the sons of light. And this is, it shows connections to a number of ideas that are also developed in the New Testament. Has this idea of a war between good angels and wicked angels, and even the character of Belial is a name that's known to the New Testament writers as well. But this particular version of the war is not the New Testament story at all. The New Testament story is like totally a cosmological story. This is like an intersection between the people on Earth, who are probably the Essenes, or the community that wrote the scrolls, and the war that's going on in heaven at the same time. And I have just a little a snippet from the end of the war scroll here, that this is basically describing the final battle between good and evil, and we can see the role that angels have here. The princely angel Michael will become the military figure that is going to come and fight in the midst of all the evil forces, and then the exact thing that happens to kind of bring about the end of days, or the end of evil in the world, is kind of an intersection between these two, the heavenly battle and the earthly battle. So when the angel Michael appears with his heavenly army, then the community, the earthly community, is going to blow the trumpets. And when the army of the Kittim, the army of the Romans, march forward, they're going to blow the trumpets, and they're going to stretch out their arms, and the Romans are just going to fall over and die. And that's their expectation of the cosmological power that they're acquiring from their relationship with the angels and the agency that God will have to redeem them from the Romans. Well, what do we do with this? It's cool for the development of our understanding of like apocalyptic traditions and even the book of Revelation and other apocalypses. But it also tells us why the Essenes and like-minded communities might have been so willing to fight the Romans in the region of Jericho, in the battle that was to become Masada, and the conflict leading up to it. And that is this kind of belief that people are living in the end days, that there's an army in heaven that is going to come down, and if you so believe that you're living with angels among you, and you pray to when you pray your Sabbath prayers, the angels pray with you, which I will get to in a second, that certainly the army of heaven will come and lay its place its hand, stretch out its hand on the Romans, and they will fall over. So that's the idea of the war scroll. Separate from kind of this violent imagery of heaven and the end of days, we also have kind of a revelation of heaven itself, and in more particularly in the idea of a heavenly city and a heavenly temple, or it's not always clear whether something is a heavenly temple or an eschatological temple, like a temple that happens at the end of time. But this is also a text we have from Qumran, is a unique description of the heavenly temple and the heavenly Jerusalem that is revealed to maybe the teacher of righteousness or maybe somebody else by means of angels. So the angel gives a description of the dimensions, the gates. Each gate is for a tribe of the 12 tribes. Even down to the windows and doors are described in this particular vision of heaven. We get a brief description of the worship in the heavenly temple. And then one of the reasons why we think this does connect to the the community of Qumran specifically, and their sectarian beliefs, is that it ends with an apocalyptic prophecy similar to what we find in the War Scroll. And I put a little quote from that on the right-hand side of the screen here. It says, a son of Belial is coming to plan to oppress my people, but I won't permit him. This is kind of, this Belial language is language that we associate with kind of the Qumran imagination of the end times. Yep, Beth.
Yeah, I have a question about that. I mean, this is written in sort of King James style, which obviously is a choice. So are these texts formal or, written in formal language? I'm thinking comparing to the New Testament, which is mostly written in not formal language at all. And
it is a great question. And it's funny, Yair and I were talking about this a little bit this morning as well. I am using a translator named Geza Vermesh. And he was a Christian. He passed away a few years ago. I think a Roman Catholic priest who produced a complete translation of the scrolls. I use Vermesh because he completes the texts where other people leave gaps. He'll try to fill it in, which makes it a little bit more readable. But one of the most annoying things that Vermesh did, God rest his soul, was to render everything in this King James sounding language. So that is a stylistic choice, and it's unfortunately I've made the decision to use his translation for other reasons, which leaves us with that. In terms of the New Jerusalem text, first of all, I should say the New Jerusalem text is in Aramaic, which is unusual for Qumran. Most stuff is in Hebrew, but it's sort of matter of fact. It's not highly colorful or descriptive language. And so it is also kind of plain speaking. The War Scroll, the War Scroll is also kind of, they're somewhat matter of fact. I think is maybe the best impression that I can give you. They're not purposefully imitating the biblical style, but they use a lot of the same language. But it's almost written like, I don't know quite how to describe this impression. It's almost written like, this is kind of how this is supposed to be. I'm just relating it to you, for a factual record, is maybe the way of the style, as opposed to like a storyteller's style, where there's a lot of focus on holding the reader's attention and providing details that are, keep the reader engaged and that sort of thing. You don't see as much of that, but yeah, so I'm sorry if I haven't answered your question very well, but
no, actually you did, because because the all of translation is interpretation, and what by this particular translator that you used chose to use that formal King James, which glosses over and
I think I even have a couple of words that are really not words that we would use in contemporary English. The ABEG translation is a little bit better at this problem, but I think the gist of it is still there. Like, so I'm guessing, I don't have this passage memorized, but I'm guessing "Son of Man" is Barinosh in Aramaic. It's probably Eretz Yisrael, or however it's rendered in Aramaic. So it's not totally different from this text, but it is definitely a choice that he made that I suffer with a little bit when I
was looking more at when wilt thou gather. I mean, "son of man" is an idiom, right? And that's a common idiom in the Mishnah.
Yeah, and neither wilt nor thou are Aramaic words, right? So it's quite, yeah, he is definitely making it seem more biblical than it might be. Yeah. So yeah, great question, and great to point that out. That's readily observable, I guess, in this particular translator that I use. I'll try to switch up the translators a little bit if I can. So this is a totally different text, a fragmentary text, but this appears to be in the genre of what we would call exorcism. And so exorcisms are texts that you either read or proclaim or wear as an amulet or something like that, that are meant to provide protection or deliverance against negative spiritual powers. And so and in this case, when we're wondering about whether Qumran has demons, we don't have a lot of texts with demons in them, but we know that they're there because you know, when we read this little exorcism, they enumerate what they think the wicked spiritual forces are, and they call them by all these different categories: spirits of destroying angels, spirits of bastards. I really need to find out what that term is, and whether that's like the spirits of unclean sexual unions, or if they think the demons are like between wicked angels and human beings. I don't know what the word means there, so I'll just, if you raise your hand, I don't have an answer to that. But and then they call it demons, like the Greek word demons, daimonia. Liliths are kind of evil sexual spirits that we know about from later Jewish writing.
But they come from the Babylonian. There's a Babylonian spirit called Lilith.
Yeah, but what's fascinating is that the Liliths are already in the land of Israel, or the ideas of, I don't know if the Liliths themselves moved, but you know, the idea of Liliths is already in the land of Israel in the Second Temple period. Yeah, so it's if that was brought from Babylon, it was brought very early. It's not just something like that we get from the Talmud from like the 5th century or something like that. So Liliths are there as well. And then these other kind of, you know, howlers, I don't know, like banshee kind of howlers and yelpers, and these kind of maybe more auditory spirits. But the speaker of the exorcism invokes God as a way of kind of sending these spirits away. And that's a like classic phenomenon of exorcism that we find in Egypt. We find it in Jewish early Christianity. We find it in the bowls and amulets from Babylon. Bowls mostly from Babylon, amulets from Galilee. So it's like they have like this kind of business of exorcism that is part of their community life as well. And it's unlikely in my mind that this text is something that somebody is preserving from somewhere else. This is more like, this is the kind of stuff that you keep close by. So in my last few minutes, I want to say a little bit about the idea of worshiping with the angels and having mystical communion with the angels in the Qumran community. And again, we have examples from a variety of texts that tell us about this. One of these texts is called the Song of the Sabbath Sacrifice. And the gist of the Song of the Sabbath Sacrifice, it goes into quite a bit of detail about the ranks of the angels and the roles that they play in producing the worship of God in heaven. But the idea is that in the worship on the Sabbath, or maybe just some Sabbaths, but the details there are a little fuzzy, that the earthly community, like the earthly choir and the choir of angels, join together in the praise of God in the worship on the Sabbath. So that is, again, this is a unique text from Qumran that gives us that that conception. Additionally, a text that I showed last week, the Community Rule for the Last Days, had this kind of non sequitur in it about angels when it was talking about the categories of people who were allowed to hold office in the community. And it talked about people that were excluded for various reasons, either for physical deformities or mental incapacities or for moral behavior. But the reason that it gives that for them being excluded is because the angels of holiness are there in the assembly when they're having the assembly and they're reading the Psalms and singing the Psalms and reading the Torah together. they believe the angels are present there at Qumran with them. And then the most elaborate development of this idea is in these texts that we call the Thanksgiving hymns or hodayot. These are hymns of praise that are found in one of the large scrolls, one of the large original scrolls from Qumran, and also fragments of them are found. Additional fragments are found together. That's the hodayot scrolls. So in terms of psalms and songs of worship, there are more texts of psalms, both psalms that we know from the Bible, psalms that we don't know from the Bible, and these Qumran specific psalms called hodayot. There are more copies of this kind of material than any other category of material at Qumran. And it has led people to speculate along several lines. One is that it's possible that maybe individual members of the community had a book of psalms that they used themselves. There's so many copies of psalms that one wonders, like, why do they need all these copies of psalms? You know, and so we have the possibility that maybe each member of the community is kind of singing or following along or reciting psalms themselves from a psalter, a songbook that they themselves possess. And that psalter might contain both songs that we know from the Psalms of David and psalms that we don't know otherwise. We know them only from Qumran. Another theory is that that kind of proceeds from this is that the core of the worship life at Qumran may also be in the singing of psalms. We don't know much about their reading of the Torah, like as a ritual practice, as like a religious practice. We don't know as much about that, other than a brief comment that we have in Josephus about the fact that they do read it every day for several hours. So they have some kind of what we might think of as a synagogue practice where they read the Torah together as a community. But the prayer life of the community seems to be oriented, as best we can tell, around these hodayot and around these psalms. Now, the Thanksgiving hymns themselves, a lot of people have speculated that they may be the original compositions of this teacher of righteousness. That, as I just kind of mentioned, they themselves may also be incorporated into the worship of the community. So we imagine there might be a time of the day when the community is sitting and reading the Psalms together. Some evidence of that includes, I'm sorry, I've two hands, one from Andy and one from Judy, or is that one hand?
That's one hand. I find it interesting that you say the worship seemed to revolve around the Psalms, because those aren't a big part of the rabbi service. Yeah, we do have Psalms, but there's other things. And I'm thinking that maybe the Essenes were closer to the temple because Psalms were originally used in the temple.
Yeah, and that is, it matches with the theory that we talked about earlier, that the group may have started as like dissidents from the priests of the temple. One could speculate, one could imagine, I guess, that maybe these were singers from the temple. Maybe the teacher of righteousness or the core of the community themselves were among the Levite singers in the temple. That's totally imaginable. And the reason that if that's the case, then the Psalms that they have might be really, really cool, because that might mean that we have some Psalms from the temple that aren't in the Psalms of David. But that's, it's speculative. I also want to be a little bit cautious that speculating that, like, fragments do not equal people and fragments do not equal rituals. So this is religious studies people kind of speculating about the ritual practices based on the texts, which is, it has its limits in terms of the certainty that we can have about that kind of a thing. Sometimes we find deviations from that as well. But I want to just show the last slide that I have is just an example of a Hodiot hymn here. And just to show this one, I mean, I've handpicked this one to suit my purposes, but to show how much of the ideas from the community get written into these hymns, and why we think the worship life of the community and the theological content of the scrolls match up with each other. And so I'll just I'm not going to do a dramatic reading of this particular hymn here, but I'll just point out some of the examples. So it begins, and I apologize to all, and especially to Beth, that we have some more King James style formulation here from Gaze of Ramesh. But we start out with phenomena with language that is imagery that is quite at home in the Psalms of David. I thank you, God, that you have redeemed my soul from the pit, from the hell of Abaddon. That's Abaddon. I don't think is a word that occurs in the biblical Psalms. Maybe it does. You've raised me up to an everlasting height. So we can see, like, it starts out sounding like a biblical psalm, but sounding like a biblical psalm of confession or a psalm of repentance, which is a genre that there's individual laments that are around personal sinfulness. There's a dozen or so of them in the Psalms. But then it goes off the ranch, so to speak, into the particular ideas of the Qumran community as well. So right away, so first of all, we have this: may stand in the host of the holy ones and enter into community with the congregation of the sons of heaven. So we see that the confession here is sort of being invoked, in order to stand among the angels. And so there's two ways of reading that. This could be kind of looked at as a last days type of thing, but it also could be looked at as, like, again, the understanding that in the Sabbath or in the assembly, that the angels are right there. And so in order to kind of bring oneself back into the company of angels, you have to kind of rid yourself of this kind of spirit of sinfulness, or perverse spirit of great sin. And then it pivots quite quickly to these Platonic questions about human beings. Suddenly it goes from being concerned about the company of angels to being concerned about everlasting destiny among the spirits of knowledge. Somewhat Greek Gnostic kind of a sensibility. So they have that going on as well. And then a pivot to the skeptical wisdom of kind of Job and Ecclesiastes and the Egyptian tradition. Am I, nothing but a creature of clay? And what is my worth? These are questions that people are really asking themselves. Like, what is a man? What is a human being in this time period? And then we have a little bit more of kind of the confessionary language, and then it pivots to the Qumran conception of the final days. So it's, imagines that part of the sinful existence of human beings is living in the time of the wrath of Belial. Not just living in the nature of human sinfulness, or living in a time where Israel is apart from God, but in a time specifically of this figure of Belial. And then, finally, it's an affirmation of the eschatological ending that we have in the War Scroll. So, we get narrated right in this hymn that, again, we think they're singing as part of their worship life, maybe on a particular day or maybe every day. The ending of that is, a recitation not about how clean my spirit is, or how I'm going to go up to the temple, or how I'm going to be restored, have victory against my enemies, the kinds of things that we find in the Psalms of David. Instead, it recites kind of a faith in the intervention of these angels and heavenly hosts into the world to kind of clear up the misfortune brought about by this character Belial. And so that's where I will leave the Hodiot. The Hodiot, I'll have to find a way to share some of these texts with you, but the Hodiot are fascinating and sometimes really kind of hauntingly beautiful texts to read as well, not just information for a historian, but really kind of digging into the sensibilities and the ideas of what's bothering them about the human condition and bothering them about the world in which they live, and expressing kind of their hope for what a different world might be. And so I will I'm right at 8:29 if there are other questions. But yep, Aaron.
Yeah, you mentioned a slide back something called the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice.
Yes.
So is there any evidence that they broke so far from the temple that they were doing sacrifices there at Qumran?
Some people think that they did. I'm not sure I believe that. And the reason why is archaeological. And I know, like, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but recognizing the products of animal sacrifice in the archaeological record is quite easy. Like, it's easy for archaeologists to find, well, like the ash altars. Like, I'm used in my imagination, the temple of Apollo at Didyma on the western coast of Turkey, a place that I happen to have visited. There's just huge ash heaps where people, like, it's just like, you know, especially if they're doing like Holocaust sacrifice, like whole burnt offering sacrifices, it just produces a lot of material that doesn't further decompose in the archaeological record. And so we would expect to see some kind of an ash heap. That's not proof that it didn't happen. But it is, it makes me skeptical as well. So that's the best answer that I can offer. Ellis. Ellis, you might be on mute.
Did they believe in a Messiah at the end of days?
These stories don't tell a story of a Messiah. They tell a story really about the Archangel Michael intervening. So there are other texts that are kind of characterized as messianic, and maybe I'll try to bring some of those texts up when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Christianity and some of the ideas about early Christianity. Some Christian readers of the scrolls will want to read Christian messianism into Qumran. I'm not totally sure it's there, but if you'll permit me to bring that up next time, I'll try to include a slide with a textual example of what people call messianic materials from Qumran, and we can test it ourselves and see if we believe it or not.
All right.
Well, Scott, I thank you again for a really nice presentation. Looking
Well, thank you
forward
guys
to
as well.